Be aware that many members of the audience may be under 18 years of age. Thank you very much for participating in WonderCon and watch your language. What's this?
The OC Automata and Animatronics legacy. As you may know, here in Orange County, we are home to one of the largest collections of animatronics and audio animatronics in the world. In fact, second only to the collection that's housed at Walt Disney World. Many of those are at Disneyland Resort and also at Knott's Berry Farm. And here we have many of the folks who have a hand in that and also in some of the modern new pieces of magic. I'm Bill Butler. I'm the creative director at Garner Holt Productions. This is Garner Holt, founder and director, president of Garner Holt. Thomas Klunt's a master, modern master automaton builder and historian. No introduction, Mr. Bob Gurr. So long before we had singing pirates and frightening little children from around the world, we had automata in various ways. Some of the earliest versions started in Greece, where they were used for timepieces. They were in temples for religious purposes. They were tableau vivant, little living scenes that involved moving characters, sometimes powered by water, later by steam, and very early mechanical elements, real made gears and clockwork type devices. Later they progressed, they enhanced to something more realistic. This is Vaucanson's famous duck who could eat, walk, and excrete just like a real duck. This is an artist's interpretation of what the inside looked like, probably to dispel what it actually looked like inside. Notice the elaborate F there at the bottom of the large, very complex intestine. And then on the right, that's, I think, Thomas, is that Roberto Houdin's Psycho?
Looks like it's distorted, but it looks like it, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Looks great to me. So it's, that automaton still exists, actually, and this is one of the very first uses of pneumatics in pretend characters that later became animatronics. This was a stage illusion that could guess what you were thinking, what cards you were thinking of, and all that. Automata become a very popular entertainment, in fact, a rather refined entertainment, because they're very, very expensive, and it becomes a matter of taste in order to own these and to exhibit them. Here's an engraving showing an exhibition of automata at a very fine hall that involved fancy clockwork, purely for horological reasons, and then also characters that could write, could actually play instruments, and did all these with a faculty that was very lifelike, but at the same time, everything was done. Oh, sorry about that. Everything done with gears, with cogs, wheels, worms, all that sort of stuff, in order to make a mechanical movement into a lifelike version. This is at the Franklin Institute. Is this nowadays?
You can't see it. It looks like a Maya Degrees.
Yeah. So this is an automaton that still exists. It was built in the late 18th century, and it had the ability to write in both French and English. You notice something interesting here. The pen doesn't really leave the surface. So imagine cutting a series of gears and a mechanism that slides around that allows something to move, telegraphing it out to a pen in order to make this really refined motion. This could also draw ships and other things. All of these with sliding a rod in order to choose the different elements that it had. This is kind of neat too. On the left side is a drawing that somebody took home as a souvenir from 1835, and on the right is a modern one from this year. The automaton still works, and it still draws just as beautifully. Thomas, our resident automata expert, has brought a few things to show and share. Many of you know the famous story of Walt Disney picking up an antique automata songbird from a trip to New Orleans that helped to inspire audio animatronics in the Tiki Room and all that. Thomas has a version of that.
So they started making these in Switzerland early on. Oh, can you guys hear me?
Okay.
They started making these in Switzerland early on, and wealthy people would buy them. In the dead of winter, they could hear birds singing. So they were kind of a luxury item. And the mechanism in these things is insane. It's got little bellows that acts as a compressor, and then one of the bellows, it's a split bellows. The other one it keeps the air like a tank, so it has an even pressure. So when the bird's singing, you have a, oh yes, here we go. You guys tell me if you can hear these things. That's all mechanical. It's not a recording. So this is the type of birds I understand that Walt brought back from Europe, and he had his guys disassemble it to take a peek inside. So
were you part of that crew, Bob? The disassembly crew? Were you on that?
No, I only learned about that years afterwards.
Oh.
So, just like Garner, as a kid, I went to Disneyland, looking at this man's work and all the guys that created the park originally, and it started me doing what I'm doing. I wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for this guy and for Rolly Crump and people like that. So it's really strange to be sitting here, but I'm very happy. Describing the psycho automaton and this mechanism here. I did this a long time ago. It's one of the first things I did, but this mechanism is actually based on that.
Oh wow!
On that thing, and it was a very clever. It was a magician's trick. So the idea is it sat on a clear tube, and at the time, there were master clockwork automata that seemed like they could do anything, but the magicians tried to take it one step further and made them, try to make it so they could read minds, or they could beat you in a game of chess, or they could, beat you in a game of cards, and that's what that psycho automaton did. The magician would bring it on stage, would put it on a clear pedestal, and the pedestal was rolled around, so it didn't look like it was connected with anything. This is before radio control. So,
and it's not actually life-size, too. It's
it's a little boy size. And there were actually two of them. The early one I'm talking about, it astonished people because it played a game of whist, which is kind of not often played anymore. But the magic about it is they had 3 movements in one, so it was all operated on a bellows, and they had to have the minimal amount of effort to get the maximum amount of movement. So the thing's arm, whoops, sorry, it picks up a card. Anyway, so you get the idea. You pick up a card, and this arm would pan across left and right to select a card that we're standing at.
I think those of you who are really interested could come up maybe after the presentation here and take a closer look at this. You probably should.
So,
well, if you can see that, it had a compound movement to it. So out of one point of actuation, it was actually getting 3 different kind of movements. That's something that we still use to this day. We'll show you some of those tricks on the early figures of the Jungle Cruise. Were used in the same fashion. So as automata become more and more egalitarian, there are more of them, even though they're still in good collections, they sort of fall out of favor because of their expense, because cultures are changing, and they turn into more of a fantasy mechanical thing by the turn of the 20th century. That's where this guy on the right comes in here. He probably didn't do anything, but he sure looks fancy. Later on, these things turn into robots. They stopped attempting to be as realistic as people. There was a certain feel that these were the next mechanical things. This is Gargo from the 1939 World's Fair, right? Who later had a resurgence with some Disney things. We love this in particular. Talk about bellows. This is bellows for smoking. As you can see on there, the all-important function of the 1930s, the distinction of animation from that series. And at this time, they start to, automata and early reciprocal motorized animation things are in department store windows, they're on display at World's Fairs, but they're fairly limited. They're in some parks, famously like the scenic railways down at Venice in California here, have some very limited animation. Just an idea to get something going. But the distinction now and then is that they were all reciprocal animation. They couldn't really be fully programmed per axis like a true animatronic can, and they would only have a performance that was as long as the circular motion of a cylinder or a gear was in that. Until 1955, when Walt Disney founds, just down the street, Disneyland. Here's a very, very early shot of the Jungle Cruise in its first year, 1955. The Jungle Cruise was really the home of the most sophisticated, if you could call it that, animation at the time when the park opened. It had a number of mechanical gags in it, gorillas that would pop up and jump up and down. pneumatically operated compound motion hippopotami that would slide up next to your boat. But Walt wanted something that was a little bit more sophisticated and a little more realistic. And so he asked Bob to come up with some dancing natives in 1956, the year after the park opened. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was actually 1957. Now, Bob Manning was the special effects director for the movies at the studio for Walt, and that guy was a complete wizard. He could make any kind of mechanism, make any kind of thing work for about an hour. And he came up with this single dancing native. The guy, jump up and down and do his ooga stuff with his spear and everything. It was quite a neat looking thing, but it had a train of levers and cams, and there was a guy standing with an oil can squirting the whole time. And it was very funny because Walt called me up and he says, "I like that, but that's a movie gag and it'll be busted by the end of the day. I want you to make one of those that'll last for a long time, and oh, by the way, I want 6 of them all doing different things." Okay. So, remember, this is the mechanical age, and it's going to be in the water, so I came up with a cast aluminum gearbox to have things like this, little cams and levers inside, so now it's got its own oil bath on the inside. But in those days, I decided we could use automotive parts like truck universal joints, agricultural takeoff U-joints, because number one, high production parts in the automotive industry, the parts are very cheap, but they're usually made out of forged steel or cast steel. They have little needle bearings in them. Replacement parts are quite inexpensive, so I thought that was very practical. But most people would custom build something one at a time, and I thought guys would do that are completely nuts. This is not going to work. Because we could just go to the store and buy this stuff. So the Dancing Natives today machine is almost identical to what it was. It went through a refurb, I think about 8 or 9 years ago, because it's automotive parts, sealed tie rod ends from steering rods, a lot of the universal joint parts. They can run outdoors in bad environments all their lives. So that was one of the secrets we came to immediately. Use automotive stuff. We did that for years, for a lot of product. Most people don't realize it. But if anybody went there today and they look in the pit, they say, it's just a bunch of car parts. The car parts are faster, cheaper, better.
And back to our comment about compound motion, it's also, is it not a single motor that operates the entire effect? There's only one point of power and articulation on it.
No, each gearbox has one motor, but in there's a series of levers and cams and shafts, so there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. But it's basically one motor that just sits there and runs. But there's 6 dancing natives, and they're on a big turntable that has one motor just to run that. But the way it articulates, it goes around cams, so the natives are sort of doing this like this. Every time you look at it, it's doing something different because there's different guys in different places. So if you're a little bit inebriated or fantasy-minded, that looks like 6 really big fat dudes out there.
And then I think a really wonderful piece of synchronicity, it's a very, very similar mechanism that causes the circular dancing on It's a Small World for the dolls that are on the plates.
Oh yeah, some of those lessons we learned very early. Now remember, everybody today, you're very aware of electronic controls. Very sophisticated, you can do anything in any arrangement with any kind of mechanism or electronic stuff. But in those days, the basic rule was mechanical stuff. Number one, the electronics hadn't come, the computers were years away, tape drives were years away. Ergo, we use mechanical stuff.
Another element that has not had the longevity that the Dancing Natives did was the charging rhino on the Jungle Cruise. Anybody remember this? Anybody seen video of this? It was a rather thrilling effect.
Do you have a photograph of that charging rhino?
We've got the photograph. This is the one.
Yeah, but don't run a video of it. Let me see that sucker.
We've got we got just a couple of shots here.
Oh,
Black
yeah,
and white
okay.
shot.
The 2 rhinos. 1 or 2 rhinos.
So what's the story behind this particular gag?
Well, before programming was available, we were looking to have more sophisticated animation, so one simple motion like an air cylinder goes out and it comes back, goes out and it comes back. How many actions can you get out of that? Where you would have horizontal cams and tracks with leaf springs. The gag was, and it always worked in the shop when Walt was watching it, the two rhinos would come out and wiggle and everything, and they'd look at the boat, and then the air cylinder would reverse. And the idea was that the back end of the rhino had a little cam wheel, and it was supposed to catch the spring and bounce it over so it would turn and go back, to walk away from it. Too many times those two rhinos came out and mooned the boat. We never could get a 100% mechanical added feature type thing to ever be 100% reliable. It just was not. Remember, that was right at the threshold of where, oh, we can program stuff. Oh, we can have variable speed air cylinders. That was just about to come, but I think those moving rhinos was the one that did it.
Put it over the guy.
Well, look how cool that was for the guests, though, when the rhinos actually rammed the boat.
Kind of a neat picture here over the stanchion at the side of the boat. You can see some oranges still on the trees. I know that they had to keep a lot of these orange groves in the Jungle Cruise at that time. Here it is from the guest POV shot on this. And the throw on this, or the stroke on the cylinder, it was actually pretty long, right? The advance of the character.
Which one is this?
This is one of the rhinos looking at it from like the river's edge. It looks like it's about 10 or 15 feet away.
Oh, that was the easy one. Oh, yeah, it's a long track thing.
Oh.
Yeah, when they didn't have to do trick stuff, those were very reliable.
Incidentally, GHP refurbed some of the natives a few years ago. Garner's a couple shots of them in the shop. Remember we had those? These are rising.
Yeah, those are a lot of fun to do, and it's always, it's interesting, it's like Bob says, it was really interesting to get those to refurb and find out, to look at the mechanisms and see how well built and designed that Bob did things back in those days, because, here those things have bounced up and down, 50 million times since 1955 or something when they opened, so. It's amazing how long and how durable some of this stuff was that they built back then. And it was just incredible. It still has its own life,
Simple but durable. A single actuator, you can see the blue actuator down there by the knees, lifts the character up, and a series of tie rods brings the arm and the rest of the body up at the same time. So there's a lot of efficiency out of that motion. Disneyland in 1956 opens the Rainbow Ridge Mine Ride, and that was home to some further mechanical characters similar to the Jungle Cruise characters, but a little different North American feel. In 1960, the entire attraction is reimagined, and the phrase audio animatronics is heard for the very first time. On the right is the date flyer for the reopening of the attractions in Nature's Wonderland, which mentions down there in really tiny writing the use of audio animatronics in this show, the very first time that was ever done. And this had a number of really cool gags in the show. Does anybody remember that attraction back in the day?
Yeah, that attraction was where Big Thunder is now. Yeah. Before Big Thunder.
One of the gags, most famously, were two fighting elk that would battle it out, and this was another Bob creation. Here's something showing the entirety of the scene, and these initially were on the right side of the track, and they were moved to the left at some point because they kept spooking the live mules. And so here is a shot of those, and you can see a little bit of the articulation on these. And then here's a really cool shot in the shop with a young
Who's
Bob.
that young guy there? Young Bob right there.
Can you tell us about this creation?
Yeah, that machine, oddly enough, compared to two others we had for that same tracking program, we had a mountain sheep and a bounding deer, but the battling elk machine was a typical Mark Davis drawing, where he'd make a big drawing of this gag and write about a little bit of motions like that. We didn't have to make too many drawings of it. We had they built a mold for two great big elk, and then we got some elk horns for it. And I had an idea, if you take, it was a big heavy machine. Let's say you visualize you got two battling elk, and they're going to do stuff like this. And I thought, okay, the first thing is use one cylinder and have a great big pipe frame for each one of them, and then you cross-link it with an automobile or a truck tie rod. So now the slow position of the elk, one guy's winning and then one guy's losing after a while. And then the bodies were connected to the top bearing on these arms, so the bodies were independent. But then we connected them with one single rod end at one particular point in the antler. So now you had two bodies with their antler heads kind of articulating. So another one cylinder was giving us completely random motion of two battling elk. So another right away it looked like it was a full program thing. Then the legs. So in that picture you can see some of the spicer U-joints. There's a little 4-bolt pattern up there on the U-joint. I use U-joints for everything because number one, I've already explained why we use them. They're cheaper, they're easy to make simple mounts for the frames. And then I did the same thing with the legs. We had all 4 legs on both of them. Just had a single motion, but it had an actual compound action. So in other words, we doubled it up right there. Now when it comes to the controller part, again, I remind you, this is called a camshaft. And in those days, as he pointed out earlier, you have a Bodine motor that operates a camshaft. And depending on the diameter of that camshaft, you can cut more notches into the cam. And the cam then would operate a little clippered air valve that would then operate the air cylinders. So if you get the basic thing, and you've seen one cam, you've seen them all, so each cam track ran one switch, or one valve, which then ran one cylinder. In those days, the cylinders were not servos, these were just direct cylinders. The secret weapon was, we would use flow control valves. And you all know a flow control valve is very inaccurate depending on the time of day, humidity, and wear. Aha, now we're getting free random motion. Then I found out that, this was a simple thing. We found out with a very simple cam that we had in different places on the cams, we had more switches. So we had less cams running all of this cockamamie pile of air cylinders that were simple in-out cylinders, but the way the cam was, I didn't allow the cylinder to completely bottom end on either end, because the way the valves would tell it, don't go that far, but then the flow control valve would shift it, and then depending on the time of day, the battling elk were faster or slower. It was an eminently reliable machine because it had this, it was like a truck-like thing. But from that, we learned that you could take a basic cam, a Bodine motor, and pneumatics just before servo valves started to show up. Now, this is like 1960. By 1964, we're doing servo valves. 1963 and a half, really quick. The super animation suddenly came along out of it. I'll mention the other two, the mountain sheep and the bounding deer. The bounding deer, anybody remember the bounding deer? You seldom saw it because the cable on it broke all the time. But there was a slope in the forest. Walt wanted a deer to bounce around in a triangular path. So we made a concrete trough, put a cable drive with one power shift and 2 Ivor shifts, and then we had the deer, its legs would all work by cams off of a wheel where it would ride. So this deer is going, you know, you do all that before it's away, that's bounding deer. But the deer were beautiful, but the cable, we never could get a company to come in and use their little marlin spikes and stuff to get the cable to, into a continuous cable that would last more than a couple of months. So it just died of the limits of the cable. Everything else was okay. It was there for years. Once in a while I'd hike up and I said, oh, they haven't completely buried this yet. Now, let me tell you, the last one I cannot tell you is the mountain sheep. That was my absolute best animation. It was a sheep that was supposed to come up behind a rock. It had a simple horizontal arm, one cylinder, and the little wheels that it ran on gave it this sort of, like a ram, a sheep coming around a rock. Well, it was planted right next to the trail where the mule train was. And the way we had mule train in those days, to keep everything together, all the mules were roped together. And then they had a guy riding, and the kids would ride the rest of the mules. And it was triggered with an electronic eye that the sheep would go into its action when the first mule came to the big rock. First day we turned that on, and we got to work it beautiful. Now we turned it on, the first mule comes, the mule reared up, lost his footing, went off the trail down toward the river, and he pulled all the other mules into the river, all the kids to the rider. They all went to the bottom of the river. Nobody drowned or anything. But we were told to shut the machine off. And about a week later, they brought that same mule train consist out, and that mule was just going around. He came to the rock and he stopped. And there's nothing else. Stop the mule. You're not going to get anything out of that. And I didn't realize a mule, they remembered everything they had ever learned. So we dismantled it and brought it back, but that was my best animation of the first time out it killed itself.
This is why you don't ride live animals at Disneyland. That was the beginning.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Can you believe Bob, you know, he's sitting here telling us stuff, and I'm sitting here thinking, I can't remember stuff I built a month ago. About stuff that he built in 1960.
I think it's fascinating that, you know, when he's talking about using automotive parts and all that, because all those things already had all the R&D done, and at that time Disney didn't have a lot of money to just, you know, freely spend on everything like they, of course, have now.
No, that's right. Walt was always kind of running out of money for everything, and you know, being a car and that, you know, I rebuilt my own Model A Ford engine in auto shop, and you know, I had a 36 Ford, I had to work on that all the time. So you have a general idea of stuff that works that you know, even though you don't know animation, any things like that. So it was natural to gravitate towards store-bought, strong stuff before we got into, you know, the real audio animatronics, and then it getting expensive.
I would say though too, even in our current creative process, there's a lot of things that we'll make custom CNC, but McMaster Carr is our best friend in a lot of ways. You know, a lot of our things are still common parts for that exact same reason, because they're easy to get again.
He just said the secret word, McMaster Carr. How many of you know what McMaster Carr is? Whoa, look at the mechanics of that. It used to be a big a book about as thick as this box, or a big yellow book. Now it's all on the internet. Anything known to man that you could use for something, McMaster Carr had it. And those were our vitals. We could browse through there.
Usually in the same day too. If you order.
Oh yeah, and then of course we always got suppliers, particularly automotive suppliers and associated equipment. They would come out to Disney because they might sell something, but first I would get the free catalogs. then they'd give me some sample parts, and then I wouldn't buy any more than use the sample parts for the one machine.
So that actually illustrates an interesting point. You know, the early automata are handmade pieces of art. They're like a fine timepiece or something like that, but they're not made to run with the demands of the theme park. Disneyland really introduces the concept of building things that will run for a lengthy duration to themed entertainment. Disneyland at that time was only open 5 days a week, I think. It used to take a couple days off for maintenance purposes, and of course now it's open 365. So when we design things now for the park, we have a design performance mandate from Disney and our other clients that these things need to run for 20, 30 years, sometimes at a certain length of time per day with a 99.9% availability rate. What Bob was describing there was really, you know, the growing pains of figuring out what sort of mechanical things could withstand that in a park environment. It was totally new. Switching gears, outside of the gates of Disneyland, there is a somewhat lesser known themed entertainment attraction that existed from 1967 to 1975. Anybody remember the Japanese Deer Park in Buena Park? So that was a relatively short-lived small attraction that was based on a real sister attraction in Japan. One of the denizens of that was somebody who had started to get on the map a little bit earlier than that. This is Vern Preston. Vern Preston was a sort of an unsung mechanical and animatronics pioneer and tinkerer in Southern California who had some things that actually do have some lasting impact. This is his Christmas display at his house, I believe, right, from 1955. So this is the year Disneyland opens, full of all these little mechanical bits that move on the lawn, motors, and in the same way that Bob is describing, used a lot of catalog parts for these. And at one time was a rather growing concern. In toward the end of the 60s, I think, Vern Preston sets up shop there and creates for them a robotic Japanese man that interacts with guests. A little bit about Vern?
Yeah, it's a very bizarre thing. My father was a surgeon, and he was doing, there was a man that came in and was not supposed to survive a surgery, and my dad did the surgery, the guy recovered, and when he was recovering, he was drawing like Jules Verne type things on a napkin. And I was a young sculptor at the time, and I was fiddling around with mechanical stuff. And he's, you know, my son's always drawing on napkins like that. He goes, I want to meet your son. And so I came up to California. I was living in Arizona at the time, and he had given me this book that I brought along. That I thought there were numerous copies of this out there, but apparently not. I don't think it ever went to print, but it was called Industrial Robots, Mechanical Animation. And this is the first place where I looked, where I had a description of how a cam is made. You know, because I didn't know how to control. I knew how to make puppets, but I didn't know how to control them. And that's what Bob was talking about earlier. And so when I first met Garner, I told him I wanted to do stuff like, you know, Disney type stuff, but it's so expensive that I ended up going back to cams because, you know, if you have a piece of metal, you can make a program, you know, if you have the right machine. So
I think I should interject now, if you were going to build that comment, some of your automatons are here at the show, right?
I haven't seen them, but apparently they're 909.
Yeah.
909, I think.
909. So if any of you are interested in seeing Thomas's automatons, which are the old style cam operated, they're in the booth 909, and there's some really cool stuff. Have you seen them yet today?
I haven't.
They're very cool. I haven't seen them. It's an Ottoman person, but I haven't seen the other ones, so I'd like to take a look later. But if you all want to see it, booth 909.
So Vern Preston is sort of a pioneer also in something that Thomas was alluding to. At this time, the only people that are building audio animatronics are Disney. They're not really available outside of the gates in that sense. And so there starts to be a little bit of a market for them. Most parks don't have the budget for it, so they're still using simple motorized things, and there's still a lot of companies that do window displays and things like that that are not true automata, they're more just motorized, or not true animatronics. Vern founds Jade Enterprises, Jade Electronics, which stood for Japanese Village and Deer Park Electronics. And it was a small animation shop on the grounds of the park that built really computer-controlled, true animatronic characters, invented largely by himself, which was totally first of its kind outside the gates.
He was kind of a mystery guy because I started looking for him on the internet. I started asking around, and I couldn't find anybody who knew who he was, and I couldn't understand because he was in the area where all this was happening. And he clearly was an early guy. If you look at his resume, he was doing stuff very early on. It was pretty sophisticated. And so I started throwing the net out and asking people. I got on the internet by the name of Brian Norman Smith, started digging up some of the images sitting there. Chris Merritt, Chris Crump helped find some photographs of him that I'd never seen before. So it's really been, this whole panel has kind of brought Vern out of the shadows a little bit.
And Vern, his fingerprints were, not exactly invisible at that time either. He was part of a rather large-scale exhibit on the Queen Mary that had been originally envisioned by Jacques Cousteau. What was the figure there?
Homo Aquatus, I think.
Okay, right. So it was supposed to be a figure that had gills, right? It's a human that had gills on his neck, and which I think is the thing that Jacques Cousteau said that he wished he'd have had.
Well, I only spent one day with the guy. He gave me a tour of Ride and Show. He was working there at the time, and he offered me a job, and I was playing soccer at the time, and I was just focused on, yeah, that's what I want to do while I'm young.
You shouldn't play soccer in job interviews.
And that's what's so strange to me is he gave me this book, and it looked like Chinese to me, because I'm not, I'm a sculptor first, I do a little mechanics, but I don't do what these guys do. They're really sophisticated electronics and, servo control and all that,
One of Vern's attractions, too, was a traveling Lincoln show that came out in the late 1970, I think, right, 71. There's a flyer for it here. What's interesting about this is not using, originally, did it use Disney's audio? I think I've heard this somewhere.
I don't know. I just,
I've heard that he used Disney's audio, then they actually stopped it, like gave him a cease and desist to stop using the audio from their show, but it was a pneumatic figure and it did stand up, not as sophisticated as Disney's and what Bob built, but it was a traveling show and he stood up and gave a speech and wasn't, at the time it was impressive for its date.
Had 72 individual functions, malleable mask, was a latex, I think, as Garner mentioned, all pneumatic and computer controlled, that was on a traveling stage that initially went to a fair in Indiana, Iowa, where it was not a permanent display. Here's a really great shot. This is Vern with the audio animatronic enters, or the animatronic insights of his Lincoln character here, which is a fairly sophisticated thing for somebody who's kind of kid-bashing it together himself, and he's kind of hooked up to this this device here that captures.
what do you think is going on with that device? I was going to ask you that.
I think he's trying to replicate the picture of Wakeful, with the stuff in the world from the carousel, and some other shots there. Of the interior and also of the controllers. Now the trick I think that would have been on this, and something Garner faced when he was building his first character, Uncle Sam, not long after this, is servo control of almost any of this stuff to make motions really fine. It wasn't really affordable or available outside of Disney, particularly not for something like this. Do we know where this ended up? This will be out in the world again.
He's really a mystery, that guy.
Yeah. And that's good.
I don't know. I talked to another fellow like right before this panel a few days ago, because I was still throwing out the net, and it was a guy named Eddie Sutton. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. He told me that he worked for him at Knott's Berry Farm. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. He said he worked for him at Knott's Berry Farm, and his favorite quote from Vern Preston was, "I don't need the money. The guys I owe need the money."
I think he had some connection to Knott's as a maintenance lead there, right, for a long time. So, which meant he probably ended up doing a lot of interface with Bud on Bud Rolpin on the classic Mind Ride and Bug Ride there, which had some mechanical elements, but also largely on fairy tales, which I think is probably his reason for being there. Here's a neat shot of him finishing up a model of Montezuma's Revenge. This is from the Knott's Berry Farm employee newsletter right before that attraction set to open. So speaking of Knott's Berry Farm, there are some animated characters there that were, in a sense, a proto-rival to some things in Disney. This, as you may know, is the finest attraction ever created by man or beast, the Calico Mine Ride at Knott's Berry Farm, which we had the honor of completely reimagining several years ago with all sorts of new animatronic characters and scenes and special effects. Inside of that, originally when it opened in 1960, there were no moving characters at all. Everything was a static, sort of a museum diorama type of thing. And that was because there was no availability for animation at that time, and there was also no budget for it. As the attraction matures a little bit, Bud puts in some early, very simple mechanical things. If you've been on the attraction, you know the ore carts move back and forth on the bottom of the glory hole scene, and also there's an elevator that goes up and down. But the figures largely remain static unless they were tied to a prop that moved. The guy in the middle there has a winch, and he moves up and down. Even some of the famous characters, you know, the guy who's panning for gold inside the lake room initially were just static. And so I imagine that the trip through here was kind of eerie. Everybody's frozen in time in this attraction. Later on, as Bud starts to get a little bit of return on his investment, he starts putting some simple motorized characters in key scenes. The idea is that it's so dark and you're moving by it on a train that maybe you don't notice that things aren't all moving, but you can have some key animation on some things that do. And so, as you know, the glory hole scene has 4 levels to it, and he would put a couple of animated things on each level so that their shadows would move. There'd be a real sense of animation. Most of these were real simple reciprocating motion characters like this, but they did something kind of neat and tricky at that time, back to compound motion. They had a single motor underneath that had a couple of links, one up to the head and one to the body, so that the head would turn at a different speed and position than the body. So the miner could actually rear back and aim before he strikes a pick into the wall. These mechanisms were so well built that when we redid the attraction, they remained almost entirely the same as they've always been. In some cases, we added modern pneumatic animatronic head turns and nods to them, and then silicone masks on top. This is a couple of shots of some of the figures in our shop, and you can see the inside of the characters are relatively simple. There's a simple motor with a connecting rod going up to the head of the arms to make a swinging motion. The one on the right is the trickier one that has the separated head. I don't know that Vern was active in building these to begin with. I think that these were all built in Bud Hurlbut's shop, but I know that he was part of the maintenance crew later on with these. When the Timber Mountain Log Ride opened in 1969, it had no animation at all. And if you've been on that attraction, you know that you move very, very quickly. When we were building it, we found out the average speed through each scene was 15 feet per second, which is quite quick for something like that, much faster than Splash Mountain. And so the thought in building this was that you didn't need anything that moved because you'd be going by too quickly to see it. So there's some very simple motorized characters in the mill up top. And so to that, we added a large number, over 50 animatronic characters throughout the entire attraction to add that sense of motion to it. And the number one complaint we get is that you go too fast to see any of it. So fortunately, can't control that. Back to the other players in town, Disney. In the mid-60s, they start in earnest building some real animated figures. This, as you may recognize, is Mr. Lincoln. Walt had a long-time fascination with Abraham Lincoln and wanted to develop him into what became audio animatronics character. But money and time had always slipped away. Incidentally, if you haven't seen this image before from the Garner Holt Productions archives, anybody heard of the famous Chinese head? So this is a character that was supposed to have been part of a Confucius restaurant that was behind Main Street. And this is the head from that character seated behind the mock-up of Lincoln. At the same time, at the studios are building these early things, they did have a better handle on some smaller items. These are some of the tiki birds in production at the Walt Disney Studio in 1962-63. Before these are even moved over to Mapo, or to Imagineering as we know it now. Some of the drummers from inside. This is an attraction that had a special appeal to Walt because it pushed the envelope for animation in addition to making a really unique new style of sit-down show. Incidentally, this show was originally conceived as we sort of know it today, not as a restaurant, as most people think, but as a show for the World's Fair. It would have been part of a pavilion there for Hawaiian Islands that would have had essentially the same show as we see it now on a little island out in the middle of a small pond. The restaurant idea kind of came and conflated those two. But you see in the brochuremanship for this when it first came out, one of the large elements that's mentioned is space-age technology, audio animatronics, not come for the great environment, come for the great music, come for all that, come for the technology. It's something that's kind of neat that Walt's into. So this next shot shows the confluence of two things happening at once. That's the original Mr. Lincoln sitting behind tiki birds at the Disney Studio for an unusual shot. Bob had a little bit to do with the original Mr. Lincoln character. Can you tell us about the development of that and why the studio gets stalled?
Well, we used airplane parts. I mean, we're very sophisticated. No, Walt had a secret group in the machine shop at the Disney Studio in Burbank developing an animated Lincoln, and it didn't work one bit after a year. Walt was really mad and out of time. He had Roger Berge Sr., my boss, when we went over, showed us a room that even I didn't know was in there, showed me this Lincoln, and I could see in an instant it's very heavy, it's a very pathetically designed thing, and actually had guys behind the wall helping it get up out of the chair. And the night before, they were using red hydraulic fluid, And Walt had a lady friend over there, and he was showing it animated, and the tube burst right, and the red shirt, I mean, the white shirt then turned red. She was furious. How dare you make a show that's going to reenact the killing? Oh, Walt was in a really bad mood. And I remember we didn't have this 90-second meeting, and he pointed at this thing, he said, Bobby, I want half the weight and twice as much motion, and I want you to get going now. And that was the instruction, and within about 2 days, he phones up and says, say, would it be helpful if we took a picture of an actor, and we'll give you a moviola strip in 16 millimeter, no, 35 millimeter, and you can see where you're going to put your parts. That would be very helpful. So, like, on Saturday, I go to the studio, and he's got Royal Dano, a famous actor, and we got a little teeny setup, and there's just Royal and Walt, myself, and a camera guy and a gaffer. And they were going to record this when we had the mirrors rigged up. And the guy goes through the spiel, and I thought, that sounded pretty good. And then Walt says, no, do that over again. And I remember the actor looked up a little upset and did it again. I thought, well, that one didn't sound very good. And then Walt did the same thing again. He says, no, Royal, now I want you to do it again. And I felt so sorry for the poor man. He did this kind of a coat, and then he did it again. That was the soundtrack. He knew Lincoln was having a terrible time. He wanted the voice of a very irritated Lincoln. The guys, that's a movie on the script for me. Sure, the script was really good. I could move very fast. It took about 90 days to design the whole darn thing and go back to everything else I was working on. But I saw Lincoln as a small diameter tube airplane fuselage. By that time we had pneumatic servos, which were very, very big, and Lincoln is this little tiny skinny guy. Grover Cleveland would have been easier. Well, we made such a sophisticated jump so fast from 1960, like a battering out machine, all the way to an Abraham Lincoln. We did that jump in only 3.5 years.
And incredibly, following that too, we come back to Disneyland, build Pirates of the Caribbean, which is the next generation yet. Here's a pirate head. And then not just a few years later, start building the elements for Walt Disney World using the modern casting system that is still in use today. So we do have to move somewhat quickly, but I wanted to mention too, the modern creative process for doing work. This is something that we designed. This is the Fantastic Dragon for Disneyland out here. In the old days, automata were the work of a single artist. Somebody that could do all of those elements together. Now we have a much more collaborative process that was brought in by Disney and developed even further on. So things have a much more sophisticated way of being designed now. We're going to go quickly through some of these images. Cars for Radiator Springs Racers are being done by a group of engineers separately from folks who are doing sculptures for other attractions and other elements of the same characters that will go on top of those plastics later on. We even have specialty teams that are doing nothing but the molding and the tooling and the parts making. Here's a bunch of the masks being made for the mine ride at Knott's Berry Farm and the silicone hands for that. The other thing that we do too is we don't like to do one-offs anymore. We have a single mechanical frame that can fit inside any type of character. So if you open up some of our humans, if they're at Knott's, if they're at other parks, they all have the same innards to them. These are some of the characters for the Little Mermaid attraction at DCA and also in Florida. And also costuming. This is something that was not really as well known during the Automata days, is making these things look like they're realistic moving characters. And that's really the big difference. In audio animatronics, we're trying to convince you that something is totally real. It is not a mechanical representation of the figure. And we wind up with some things that we had done over at Disneyland not too long ago. So really, in Orange County here, we see a progression of things from the early days of the mechanical reciprocating motor things at Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm to now, home to some of the most sophisticated animatronics in the world anywhere. If anybody's been on Radiator Springs Racers, those are some of the most sophisticated animatronics built in the world. And to see where those have come, where just a scant 50 years before Bob was doing his battling elk right across the street. It's really an incredible change in both the artistry and the technology of what we have. So that's the show. We have some time for questions, if there are any.
Just make a comment, the Inland Empire, is known for fast food, right around where we live in San Bernardino, McDonald's, Baker's, a lot of Del Taco, all that came from there. And it's kind of interesting, just in this little area of Buena Park, Anaheim, and over into Glendale where Bob started, really so much of the world's animatronics really developed from there. And, obviously Bob on top of the heap with, with Disney kind of writing a book on modern animatronics, and it's it's changed so much, since then, and it's in every park, and, it's the cornerstone of the Disney parks. I used to say, because I was, of course I'm biased about animatronics, but if you were to take a Disney park and take out all the attractions that have animatronics, like Pirates Mansion, Splash Mountain, Cars, Small World, and anything else, what would you have? You'd have a steamboat and a train and a couple of simple things like an ordinary park. So I think animatronics has really been the cornerstone of the modern theme park as we know it today.
We've been told to stop. Sorry, we don't have time for questions, but we will be sticking around a little bit
Sorry,
later.
I took up the question time.
I wanted to let you know also, GHP, in honor of our 40th anniversary, has recently come out with an official animatronic function list poster, just like the pros use. So we do have these available here and also at our booth, number 1700. Thank you very much.
And don't forget, if you want to know more in detail how we did this stuff so fast, my documentary is sold at his booth.
Questions, I'm going to step outside there. If anybody has any questions for me, I'm glad to stand out there and chat with you all.
Awesome.